Thanks for joining us for this archive of Teaching American History's Saturday webinar for October 3rd, 2020. The topic of today's program was the enduring American question of, did slavery cause the Civil War? Our moderator, Dr. Chris Burkett, professor of political science at Ashland University, was joined by Dr. Jason Stevens, also of Ashland University, and Dr. Andrew Lang of Mississippi State University. Thanks again for listening.
The series that we are exploring this semester has to do with fundamental questions in American history and government. And this morning, the question that will be at the center of our conversation, a conversation that will include all of you, is did slavery cause the Civil War? Our moderator today is Dr. Chris Burkett, but I'm told that he's having some technical difficulties right now, so he'll be joining us shortly. As soon as he does, I will be handing over the reins to Dr. Chris Burkett, who of course is a professor of political science at Ashland University and the director of the Ashbrook Scholar Program here at the Ashbrook Center at Ashland University. Joining me also is Andrew Lang. Andrew Lang from Mississippi State University. Andrew, it's a pleasure to have you here with us this morning. Thank you for joining us for this conversation. I know this is a topic that you've thought a lot about, you've worked a lot about, and I know that you're an expert on this question. So thank you so much for joining us here this morning.
Thanks very much for having me. I've been looking forward to it.
Me too. My name is Jason Stevens. I'm director of teacher programs at the Ashbrook Center and visiting assistant professor at Ashland University. And so as we start this conversation, again, we're still waiting for our distinguished moderator to join us, Dr. Chris Burkett, who's having some technical difficulties. Jeremy, if you wouldn't mind maybe forwarding him the email with a new link. I just got a message from Chris via text. We're trying to work that out. So in the meantime, Andrew and I will just have a conversation here. So the question is, did slavery cause the Civil War? And that gets me thinking, Andrew, I don't know about you, but my answer is simply, well, yes, of course. Why have a conversation about that? Why spend the next, hour and 15 minutes or however long this will go this morning, getting to the bottom of that question? If the answer is simply yes, that may be what many are tempted to do when it comes to trying to answer that question. Is that sufficient? Is it enough just to say yes and leave it at that at the end of the day and move on? Or is this something that is maybe there are more layers here than what may appear at first blush?
I mean, if I'm going to be a smart aleck about it, of course, it's a one-word answer, yes, and we can shut this down and go home. But of course, I mean, as with every historical question, and this is actually one of the more frustrating questions in all of American history, simply by virtue of the way the popular culture frames it. Did slavery cause the Civil War, which presumes that the answer could potentially be no. But everybody who lived at the time would not have understood that, would not have understood no as the answer. And so I think the better way of looking at this is exactly how you described it. There are many layers to this. I actually had this as an essay question for my senior level Civil War class last week on their first exam. I didn't ask, did slavery cause the Civil War? I asked, how did it? So we just eliminate the binary yes or no right at the outset, and accept the premise that yes, indeed, it is at the center, the heart, the apex of this this entire crisis, if not the entire 19th century. And so, how did it cause it? Why did it cause it? I think will be what we're talking about today.
Yeah, that's a great point, Andrew, and very, very interesting. I know that the Ashbrook Center recently, as part of their core document collection, put out a volume called Causes of the Civil War. The title was Causes of the Civil War, implying, of course, that there was more than one cause, or at least it would seem that way, right? With the plural causes. But as you've described, no, there was only one cause: slavery. And every cause of the Civil War, whether political, constitutional, moral, social, or economic, somehow, right, and that how is the question that you've explored with your senior students, somehow it always came back to slavery in one way or another, right? So you hear about the famous states' rights doctrine. Well, a states' right to what exactly? Well, the right to hold other human beings as slaves, or the economic arguments involving tariffs. Well, what's at the center of that? Well, cotton, right? The main product of slavery in the South. Now, I don't want us to focus maybe on combating the Southern revisionist take on the Civil War that emerged after the conflict. I don't think, and as you've already described for us, Andrew, I don't think that it's accurate to say that, well, there were many causes of the Civil War, of which slavery was just one. I also don't think it's accurate to say slavery had nothing to do with the Civil War, right? I mean, slavery was the cause of the Civil War, but as you described, well, it's really, really important to have a clear understanding, a clear picture of how slavery caused the Civil War. So maybe I could ask you to say, maybe can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, before I do, I should add, I always invite my students to consider a technicality here.
Mm.
And that is, there is no question, absolutely no question at all, that secession would never have happened without slavery.
Mm.
But the actual fighting, the actual conflict, technically speaking, does not happen because of the institution, right? It happens when we read Lincoln's first inaugural. He makes both distinctions, right? It's the question over slavery's expansion leading to secession, but then it's secession itself that leads to war. Even though slavery is looming large in all of this. So I think it's important to understand that distinction. But going back to your question, you know, we all know that in order to answer any question pertaining to the Civil War era, there's no better person who can answer that than Lincoln himself.
Mm.
And he actually, in the second inaugural, of all the amazing words, phrases, sentences, and just the whole thing, there's one fairly innocuous word that I think always stands out to me, at least. It's toward the beginning when, or at least, let me see here. Yeah, it's in the second paragraph when he's talking about 1/8 of the whole population of the U.S. were colored slaves localized in the southern part of the nation. The slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow, and it's the word somehow that I always come back to, the cause of the war. David Blight at Yale says that we've been trying to explain the somehow ever since. And it's such a self-evident, simple phrase that Lincoln uses. And the genius of that phrase is that he's including white Southerners and black Southerners and free African Americans in his all new.
Mm.
There's no judgment. There's no placing one against the other. Everybody in the mid 19th century somehow knew that this is why we're here. But then the next sentence is even more illustrative because he starts to explain the somehow. It's not necessarily slavery where it existed, at least politically speaking. Perhaps in principle, people oppose slavery for where it existed, but politically and constitutionally, Lincoln's laying out the argument. It's all about the future of slavery and the future of the nation. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. That's the debate of the entire 1850s. What is the national future going to be? What is the role of government in regulating the territories? What is the constitutional argument in restricting or enlarging slavery. Can the federal government even do this? Should it do this? And every federal institution has a say in this until consensus and compromise can no longer be reached, because there is no middle. There is no middle ground by this point. So I'll stop there, at least for the time being. But it's that somehow that I think that we should try to unpack.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And something else that has always struck me about Lincoln's second inaugural on this question about slavery being the cause of the Civil War. Elsewhere in the second inaugural, I don't think you read it in your remarks, but if you keep reading, you find that Lincoln, who I agree with you completely, right? You want to understand sort of the nature, the cause of the Civil War, go to Lincoln. Lincoln refers to slavery. He doesn't, throughout that speech, he doesn't say that slavery caused the Civil War, or Confederate slavery caused the Civil War, or Southern slavery caused the Civil War. It's American slavery, he says. That strikes me as pretty significant, that this is something that Lincoln doesn't lay on the South, right? As Lincoln said in another place, right, we would be just like them in their position if we came up with their institutions in their time and their place. But it's American slavery that is the great sin that God has given to both sides this terrible war to make a recompense. It's not just a Southern institution. The North benefited from slavery as well, materially, economically, politically, in many ways. They share some of that guilt, some of that burden for the institution of slavery. I see that Dr. Chris Burkett has joined us. Our moderator is here. Chris, I'm thankful you're here. We were struggling along here for the past quarter hour or so with me as a moderator. I'm thankful that the real moderator now is with us here. Chris, welcome.
I don't think you were struggling at all. I could hear as I was finally log in officially. So my apologies for the difficulties here, but thanks. And by the way, I was listening to both of you speak, and you've been doing a great job. And Andrew, I don't think we've actually officially met before, so it's very nice to meet you. I mean, I know of you. Have we met? I don't think we have we?
I don't believe so.
No.
I was I did one of the MAG sessions or programs over the summer, but I don't know if I saw you in one of the online forums. So it's nice to meet you. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Yeah. And I heard, and you started exactly where I was going to start with that line from the second inaugural, that word somehow, because to me, the question, I mean, the tagline for today's question is, did slavery cause the Civil War? And the answer to me is yes, but and you guys have started to address some of the other questions I had. In what way, right? In what particular ways did slavery influence the Civil War? Were there other factors connected to, or maybe disconnected from, slavery, but in combination with slavery led to the thing? So I think you guys have been approaching this question exactly the way I was going to start anyway. So keep going. You're all doing great.
Well, I should add, Jason brought up a good point. I mean, it's prudent for us to recognize that, I mean, all of the northern states, or at least the states north of the Ohio River and north of the Mason-Dixon line, were themselves anti-slavery states politically and legally. But that does not at all mean that the northern states are absolved in the system by any means. There's a few facts and figures that speak to this. Slavery is not a regional institution. It's not a Southern institution. It's not even a national institution. It's a global institution, to be sure. 80% of 80% of the American cotton supply in 1860 fed the entire world. Okay. 90% of Britain and France's cotton imports are from the American South, which means the United States. In addition to that, the 1860 census records the asset value of enslaved people at $3 billion. That's $75 billion in 2020 dollars. That would place it as the 10th largest industry in the entire world today. In 1860, that asset in people as property value was more than American banking, industry, and railroads combined. And this does not even take into account the land on which enslaved laborers toiled. So even if we just want to take a purely amoral, rational look at secession, we can look at the financial figures. There's a lot at stake. And I tell my students, especially in Mississippi, if you go to war and try to defend a system that's based entirely on people and land and lose, and then 2/3 of the state's wealth is wiped out in 4 years, there's going to be implications that we're feeling down to the present day. Mississippi was per capita the nation's wealthiest state in 1860. 6 of the 10 wealthiest counties per capita in 1860 resided in the Deep South. This is the epicenter of national political, economic, and social power, unquestioned.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, Andrew, you're touching on a distinction that Billy raises in one of the questions. By the way, can you see the chat, the questions? If you can see questions coming in, feel free to address any of those that you feel like addressing. But he raises the conflict or tension between the two economic ideologies, right? The conflict between the two. Mentioned Southern adherence to slave labor versus the North's free labor, which required a change in the Southern society in order to fit a modernized industrial world by the 1850s, right? So you've started to touch on, mentioned some of the distinctions there, but I find it interesting, as you're mentioning, that though there's a very different economic system, there is a great degree of wealth in both systems, right? North and South, which means there's a great deal at stake in the future of the nation with regard to the war. So again, feel free to jump on any of these questions that come in.
I think I will just right quick. I don't want to dominate this, but I want to address the slave labor, free labor question. I deal with this a lot with my students. I think it's important for us not to think of the late sectional crisis as one in which we envision an industrial North and a modernizing North versus an agrarian pre-modern South. Mainly because, or for 2 reasons. Neither side would have considered themselves either modern or pre-modern. We have to think of mid-19th century Americans who thought of themselves as incredibly modern, directing the course of global progress from their own democratic system. In addition to that, most Northerners did not work in industrial capacities. 80% of the Northern population lived on small independent farms in 1860. I think Rhode Island is the only state that counted 20% of its laboring class as working in an industrial capacity. So what do we do with this? It's really a question over what kind of agrarian republic is this going to be? Is this going to be an agrarian Jeffersonian system, ironically, that the North envisions, right? In which the independent, small, self-sustaining farm, is that going to lead to the personal independence of the individual and of the family? Or is it going to be a system in which land is dominated by a tiny elite band of oligarchs, really, who control tens of thousands of the best cotton planting lands in the whole world, thereby pushing out competition from middle and lower class white people, all the while using a bound, coerced, permanent labor system to sustain wealth and influence? I think that's the question. I'll end there.
Well, that was very, very thoughtful. Just reading through some of the questions coming in on the chat. If I can back up just a little bit, I mean, part of the reason the question, did slavery cause the Civil War, persists, I think, in the minds of some is because, well, there are a number of reasons. When you look at the explicit reason given by some of the seceding states, almost, I mean, with the exception of a handful, none of them use the word slavery explicitly, right? I mean, some of them do make references to the institution, but there's that language of a peculiar institution or the right of a state to control its own domestic institutions. So the word institution seems to equate pretty directly, I think, to slavery, right? But there is a question raised, I think, in the chat: to what extent, when the various states are talking about their domestic institutions or peculiar institutions, is that a direct reference always to slavery, to the institution of slavery?
Yeah, I think the answer to that question is yes, absolutely. And if you're looking specifically at the state articles or declarations of secession, for example, I think we have two documents that we asked the audience to look at in preparation for this conversation, from the first two states that had so-called seceded from the Union, South Carolina and Mississippi. The line from Mississippi, I think, is most clear in this regard. So why are the southern states seceding? According to their own words, Mississippi says, quote, this is the first sentence of the second paragraph in their January 9th, 1861 Declaration of the Immediate Causes of Secession. Mississippi says, quote, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, end quote. Right? So there's no mincing of words here. There's no sort of, trying to say, well, slavery has nothing to do with the Civil War. Mississippi is saying it has everything to do with the Civil War. And I would just add that when I was doing research for the core document volume Causes of the Civil War, which the Ashbrook Center put out last year with a lot of original documents related to this question, I went through, I read all of the articles of secession from the seceded states, and it turns out that a clear majority of the states call slavery out by name as the principal cause of their separation from the Union. So, for example, South Carolina and Mississippi, we see, right, very clearly call slavery out by name based on the documents that we read. But if you read the articles of secession from Georgia, from Virginia, from Alabama, and from Texas, they all mention slavery explicitly as well. Some of them don't mention slavery by name. So, for example, Arkansas doesn't mention slavery, but Arkansas does mention the election of Abraham Lincoln. There's no mention of slavery or Lincoln in the articles issued from Louisiana, Florida, North Carolina, and Tennessee, but those four were basically the shortest declarations of secession, where it was just one or two sentences or one short paragraph that didn't say much more than, we're leaving, bye-bye. And that was it. South Carolina, the first to secede, very clearly connected their cause to the preservation of slavery, as we can see in the documents here. I mean, and they do it more than once. So does Mississippi. I think so. I loved Andrew's point earlier. Well, if you ask Lincoln, what does Lincoln say? In the second inaugural, everybody knew somehow that slavery was the cause of the war. Even the South knew that, as we can see in their articles of secession. If you ask them, why did you secede? You read these documents and they're telling you it has everything to do with slavery. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, leaving no doubt in their own minds about what was the cause of taking this action.
If I could just add to this, I mean, this is 100% right. I couldn't agree more. I think the next question is, well, then why? Why are they so explicit about it? And why are they so willing and eager to be so honest? Well, it's because to them, this is the self-evident, as Alexander Stevens calls it, the self-evident cornerstone. Our cornerstone is laid, our foundation rests upon the great truth. This is a quote. The great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race is his natural and moral condition, end quote. This is the Confederacy rebuilding and reconstituting what should have been, in their minds, the old Union, right? The old Union, the old Constitution was supposed to allegedly protect this essential foundation of modern life. When the Republican Party was elected on a platform to restrict the spread of slavery, to not enforce the dictates of the Dred Scott decision, to not guarantee the expansion of property protected under the Fourth Amendment into the territories, this was a sign that the American cornerstone was being chiseled away. That's what Stevens is talking about here. The old Union is dead, but the old Union's idea, right, its essence is still alive. It's just being picked up and put in a new nation. And he's brutally honest about this. And why wouldn't he be? They were all honest about it. Read all of the speeches given by U.S. senators who were resigning their seats in the early spring of 1861. They're very clear about what they're doing, why they're doing it. I wanted to assign for today the Confederate Constitution, but things could get out of hand real quick with the amount of reading. Slavery is mentioned 10 times in the Confederate Constitution. It's mentioned, at least the word slavery, of course, is mentioned 0 times in the U.S. Constitution. Liberty is mentioned twice in the Confederate Constitution. They're very clear about what they're doing. You can even read the Confederate Constitution in a way that suggests pretty explicitly that slavery is never going to be eliminated on the state or federal level. It is consolidated, it is entrenched, it is protected. Even dissent against slavery, you can read the Constitution in a way to see that dissent is outlawed.
Great. That's fantastic. There are a number of great questions coming in, but based on some of the things both of you have been raising here, I have to ask, maybe from the playing devil's advocate here a little bit, what do you make of 2 other arguments? One is that the vast majority of Southerners, that is, let me put it this way, that the things that are the ideas that are expressed in these documents and say in Alexander Stevens' cornerstone speech don't adequately represent the vast majority of Southerners who, in terms of their motives for going to war. So is that true? Is there a disconnect between what you might call the average Southerner and those who are sort of the leaders of the movement? How did Lincoln call them? Lincoln referred to them as what? The movers, the movers of rebellion. So to what extent is that relevant, I guess, to the question we're asking today? And then the second point is, what do you make of the argument that for example, as you're both well aware, Calhoun had been making the argument for decades with regard to the idea of states' rights, including the right of a state to constitutionally secede, and that therefore, whether the issue over which the state secede is slavery or not is kind of irrelevant. It is a right of a state to secede whenever any interest of theirs is being violated. So what do you make of those sort of 2 counter arguments, if you will, to the extent that they are counter arguments to some of the points that you've been raising?
Yeah, I'll take a shot at answering that, and Andrew, feel free to jump in and interrupt me at any point. In regards to the first point, that is that the average Confederate soldier didn't really care about slavery, probably didn't own any slaves himself, and didn't view the cause of the conflict in the same way as the leaders did. I would emphasize, though, that last point. Well, what were the leaders? What were, right, in Lincoln's words, right, the movers of the conflict? What were they saying? They were saying, everybody was saying the same exact thing, right? All of the political leaders of the Southern Confederacy leading up to and during the Civil War said, we're leaving the Union because of slavery, because of our right to hold other human beings as property. There's no doubt about that, because, as Andrew read from Alexander Stevens's famous cornerstone address, Alexander Stevens, the vice president of the Confederacy, is saying point blank, yeah, slavery is the cause of this great conflict. The cornerstone of our new Southern Confederate government rests upon the self-evident truth that all men are not created equal, that the black race is inferior to the white race. That is what our new government is based upon. And the leaders of the Southern Confederacy are making the same exact argument. As Andrew mentioned, right, read those speeches from senators leaving and resigning their seats in the U.S. Congress to take up new positions in the Confederate government. They're saying the same thing. I would go back to what Grant, U.S. Grant, had to say about sort of the common Southern soldier. Grant thought these men were honorable. He didn't look down on them. He didn't want to, trample them underfoot and wipe them completely out from the face of the earth after Appomattox. He says, right, we're citizens again. We're brothers again. These were honorable men. However, and Grant adds this addendum, even though I think they fought for a cause the worst of which any people anywhere have ever fought for.
Yeah. But again, it's great, Jason. Very thoughtful. There is an argument that I've heard that, okay, so in 1861, the particular issue over which secession takes place is slavery. But for decades, again, the groundwork had been laid that there is this constitutional right to secede whenever a reserved right of a state, of a sovereign state, has been violated unconstitutionally, right, by the national government. So you go back to the tariffs of 28 and 32, right? There, when secession was first threatened by South Carolina, there was no mention, unless I'm mistaken, maybe you're aware, both of you are aware of something I'm missing. There, the issue anyway on the surface was, it's not about slavery, it's about sort of economic favoritism, right, in the policies coming out of Congress that favored the northern economy over the South. So in that particular, push towards secession, which didn't ultimately go through, as we know, the slavery seems at least not to have been an issue. So fast forward to 1861, slavery is now the issue, yes, but what's at play here is a principle that seemed to have been established in the minds of many by people like Calhoun, that whatever the issue is, it is in the Constitution that a state has the right to secede when something like this occurs or something is being violated. So how do you?
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. That is right.
Make the other
that's another layer to this conversation, and I'm glad that we're getting down here because the matter is not simply answering this question: did slavery cause the Civil War? It's not as easy as saying yes or no, right? There's this additional layer that goes back to a principle regarding, well, what is the particular sacredness of a state, or what is the principle of state sovereignty, or to put it another way, what is the nature and origin of the American Union? How you understand that question, right? Whether the states created the Union or the Union created the states, and what sovereignty do the states have as members of the Union? How you think about the Union and the Constitution, and therefore the powers of the states as part of that Union, how you think about that is going to influence how you think about this question of slavery and the causes of the Civil War. Because you're absolutely right. Going back to the late 1820s and early 1830s, and the nullification crisis, right, first raises this specter of, right, secession of a state leaving the Union in order to protect the rights of its own people if they believe that the national government is failing to do that, or passes a law that is somehow contrary to the rights of their people. Calhoun advances, right? He's the father of this argument in the early 19th century. And I know that we read the Fort Hill address as part of our preparation for today's conversation. In that speech, Calhoun lays it out very plainly, very early on. The third or fourth paragraph or something, if I'm recalling this correctly, where he talks about, right, what's the fundamental issue? The fundamental issue has to do with the nature and origin of the Union. That the states created the Union, Calhoun says, and because the states created the Union, therefore they have the power to unmake the Union. The states decided amongst themselves to join the Union, and therefore they can, of their own power and initiative, remove themselves from that same Union if they feel it's no longer serving their rights and interests. Whereas Lincoln will have a very different understanding of the nature and origin of the Union.
Yeah, right. So from that perspective, the Constitution was a contract between the sovereign states, and when any of the terms of the contract are are violated, then, as a party to the original compact or contract, the state can remove itself. Yeah, so you really see these two different views. So again, when we think of the sectional division in the country, of course, slavery is the most glaringly obvious, but there also seems to be developing these two different views on the origin of the Constitution that are sectional in nature as well. So Calhoun, clearly the sovereign states, the national government is the creature of the sovereign states, he says, right? I don't think we assigned Jackson's proclamation on nullification. Jackson makes exactly the opposite argument, right? You look at the Webster-Hayne debates, you can see both of these views emerging in the famous Senate debates in, when was that, 1831, right? So they're okay.
Yeah, and then Lincoln in his first inaugural address, and then in his famous July 4th speech, will combat the Calhounian understanding of the Union by saying, right, the states did not create the Union, but the Union created the states and gave them to whatever power that they may possess. That the Union is perpetual.
Do you find his argument persuasive, Jason? He kind of makes that argument. His response comes in both the first inaugural and in his message to Congress in special session.
Right? Yeah, that's right.
Is his argument persuasive, you think?
I find it pretty persuasive. So he has 4 arguments for why the Union is perpetual in his first inaugural. He talks about the history of the Union, the Constitution itself. He talks about the nature of politics, and just physically speaking, we cannot separate. But beyond the first inaugural and the July 4th speech, consider the Gettysburg Address. Consider the opening line of the Gettysburg Address, where Lincoln places the birth of the American nation in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, when he says in 1863, fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Lincoln says the birthday of the nation is 1776. If you ask Calhoun, though, Calhoun or Stevens, and Alexander Stevens, the argument would be, no, it's not 1776, but 1787. The Union was started, right, with the Constitution. If that's right, if Calhoun's right that 1787 is the birth of the American nation, then maybe there is something to this question of state sovereignty and a legal or constitutional right to secession. But if Lincoln's right about that, it's 1776, not 1787, that is the more important date in American history. If Lincoln's right about that, then I think Calhoun's arguments don't hold water.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in here. This is such a critical point, and it's difficult to teach and it's difficult to understand. A lot of this, as I think we're talking around what all this is ultimately attached to. The Union as a concept can only be understood if it is attached to the founding, right? And as Jason said, who's founding? Is it the founding of 76 or the founding of 87? But I saw a question in the chat about Lincoln's fragment on the Union and the Constitution in January of 1861. And I think that really helps us, in addition to the Gettysburg Address, understand what Lincoln's concept of the Union was. What is its purpose? The Union's purpose is to protect, right, in addition to the Constitution, the sacred inalienable rights, the natural rights of all individuals, right, proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence. But what we see throughout all these readings, everybody's talking about the Declaration of Independence, but it depends how and where they're going in the Declaration to justify their arguments. Lincoln's going to the essence of the Declaration, the spirit, right? As he calls it in the fragment, the philosophical nature of the Declaration, whereas Calhoun, Stevens, maybe the secession documents, I'd have to go back and look. They're looking at the Declaration in terms of process, right? We are rebelling against a tyrannical government because our rights are threatened, our tangible constitutional rights. Mm. That's where the rub comes, I think. And so, I mean, to a large extent, they're both sides are making logical arguments insofar as they go. But as Douglas points out in the reading, if you look at the Constitution and just read it word for word, as a textualist, I mean, he even calls himself a strict constructionist, which is fabulous. The Lincoln-Douglas argument holds because Calhoun's argument is all subjective. It's all based on inference and supposition. He has to read into the Constitution and read into history to find his theory. Whereas it seems to me that Lincoln and Douglas look and read the literal text of the Declaration, find the purpose of the Union, read the Constitution, find its purpose, right? We the people, in order to create a more perfect Union, to do what? To uphold liberty, promote the general welfare. There's a third one. I can't remember it. You understand the point, though.
Yeah, but if I can jump in there, Andrew, that's really, really interesting, because I think you're exactly right about that. Not only does Calhoun have to maybe read things into the Constitution, he has to read things out of the Declaration of Independence. So you mentioned again those articles of secession, and you're absolutely right, where they look at secession as sort of this constitutional or legal process that they go back to 1776 and the Declaration of Independence in order to try to make that argument, to make that case on the basis of original American founding principles. So you read those articles of secession, like in Mississippi or South Carolina, which we read for today, and you'll see references to the consent principle in the Declaration of Independence, or the right of revolution, the right to make and unmake governments, for the safety and happiness of the people. You see the secessionists using those points of the Declaration in order to favor secession. But what none of them mention is the principle that makes consent necessary, or that makes the right of revolution just, the principle of equality, the principle that all men are created equal. That is never mentioned in any of the state secessionist documents. And it is explicitly rejected by Calhoun in his speeches and documents, The Fort Hill Address makes this clear as well. Jefferson was wrong. Jefferson and the founders really believed all men are created equal, and they were wrong to hold that belief. And by the way, Alexander Stevens says the exact same thing in the Cornerstone Address. The founders really believed in equality, but they were wrong. They didn't know what they were talking about, because the real self-evident truth is all men are not created equal.
That's a really great point.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. And it's not just Stevens and Calhoun. They're all saying this, all of them. Jefferson Davis, who in 1861, at least in his premier speeches, his two inaugural addresses, one in 61, the other in February 62, he stays on the surface of all of this. He doesn't delve down deep into the slavery, equality, inequality issue. He's focused more on the right of revolution. However, he gives a speech to Congress, April 29th, 1861, where he's reminding Confederates exactly what it is they're doing. And the race issue, the slavery issue, the inequality issue, the rejection of the Declaration, that's all over his speech. This is natural, organic, self-evident to these folks. There was a question earlier. I think maybe I misunderstood, maybe I misheard. Okay, so we're talking about essentially elites, right? Why are the majority of white Southerners seemingly going along with this when 75% of white Southerners didn't own slaves? That's a good question. Why would they support this? This isn't really in our readings, but you can find this argument all throughout the documentary evidence as well. And it boils down to one premise. I'll give you two examples. In January 1861, the most prominent Southern newspaper, arguably, DeBow's Review out of New Orleans, published an article that essentially said, or at least made the argument, why should non-slaveholders potentially support secession in the name of slavery? And he said, the non-slaveholder of the South preserves the status of the white man and is not regarded as an inferior or a dependent. He is not told that the Declaration of Independence, when it says that all men are born free and equal, refers to the Negro equally with himself. This argument goes back way into the 1830s and 40s, and particularly the 1850s. The Richmond Enquirer in 1856 said this, boiled it down to this point. In this country alone, and of course 1856, the United States. So in the United States alone, this perfect equality of civil and social privilege exists among the white population, and it exists solely because we have black slaves. Freedom is not possible without slavery. So then we read this into the more constitutional legal arguments that Calhoun is making about the right of a state, about the nature of the compact union. You then infuse the racial ideas, the ideological ideas of slavery into this. And we get a pretty clear picture about why 11 Southern states secede between December 1860 and March of 1861, or April of 1860, May of 1861. Right. Pardon me.
No, that's a really great point, Andrew, and that actually, I think, provides us an opportunity to sort of segue back to some questions that were asked earlier. You're talking about from the perspective of the Southern mind. Yes, there were the movers, but then why did everybody else go along with it? Those were great reasons. So, if I understood it in a certain way, from their perspective, the North is waging war on them. Is waging a kind of moral war against them for something that they don't view as necessarily see as immoral. In a certain sense, I'm oversimplifying it, but there were a number of questions earlier. In fact, there were 3 in a row of going back to Stacy asked. Let's see if I can find it. Stacy said slavery was clearly important to secession. How significant was slavery to the Northern decision to engage in war, maintain the Union? Shaylin discuss the motivation for strong Northern opposition to slavery. Mentions Horace Greeley and others. And then right after that, where was this? Somebody else asked us to discuss. Oh, I missed it. There were 3 in a row that had to do with talk about the Northern motivation with regard. In what sense did slavery motivate the North in the war? And if before you start to think about or answer this, let me just say, if you don't mind, this reminds me that Calhoun himself at one point said in the Oregon speech on the Oregon bill that if the Union should ever split, it would in fact be over slavery, but the onus would be on the radical minds of the North, in particular the abolitionists. So maybe you could talk about there's other view. There is this view that, among some, that it was the abolitionists who forced the war, who forced the hand of Southern slave states into having no alternative but secession. So thoughts on that? That was a long, rambling kind of question. I apologize.
No. This is such a key theme to understand. Why did loyal citizens of the United States fight? We always hear to preserve the Union. Well, what does that even mean? That's an esoteric philosophical concept. Whereas white Southerners, whether they own slaves or not, you can make the argument that they're fighting simply to defend their homes and their territory. That's more tangible, right? It's easier to justify a war on the defensive. So how do you justify a war on the offensive? Why not just let them go? Why not get rid of this horrific problem that's roiled the country for 5 decades? Let these crazies go, and we'll be done with it. Well, that was actually the abolitionist argument. We finally have a chance to get rid of them. But that is not the majority view. And so, of course, the onus is on Lincoln to explain this. And he does from day one of the war until the day he dies. And it's critical to understand that nothing ever supplants union as the principal motivation for loyal citizens. What does that mean? He goes into this in the first inaugural address and pretty much every speech he gives during the war. What does union mean? Union is to preserve the union means to preserve the cherished legacy of the founding generation. What does that mean? A democratic republic predicated on a constitution that upholds individual liberty, restricts government coercion, allows the opportunity for individual common citizens to better themselves economically. Okay, well, this still doesn't really answer the question. Again, how does the Confederacy threaten this? Won't there still be a United States after the war. Well, sure. But the problem comes when we start to recognize that a Confederate States of America and a United States of America are each claiming legitimacy as the true American nation. If the United States allows a Confederate nation to exist in direct contrast, opposition to, and rejection of the founding generation, then people might look at what's happening in North America and say, well, the founders' work is not self-evident. What they proclaimed is not universal. There's this alternate course of Americanism that's predicated on hierarchy, social order, ethnic distinctions. In other words, the Confederacy looks a lot like Europe. This is what it means to uphold the Union. And I think it's an entirely convincing argument.
Yeah, that's really well put, Andrew. Thank you. That's very clear. Helps to clarify the issue, make it crystal clear. Actually, that's very helpful. We have a number of other great questions that have come in. Nell asked earlier, why do we think the war occurred in 1861 and not earlier? I think that's a great question. Either of you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, that is a great question. I'll just say quickly, it could have happened earlier than 1861, and there were several times where it very nearly did. But it was avoided mostly because of the statesmanship of American leaders at the time in order to forge a compromise between the two sides that's succeeded in alleviating tensions. Right. So I'm thinking specifically about the compromise of 1820, the compromise of 1850, Andrew Jackson, who Dr. Burkett mentioned earlier, his response to the nullification crisis in the early 1830s. The statesmanship of men like Clay and Webster, old line Whigs, Clay, whom Lincoln, of course, called his beau ideal of a statesman, and even Calhoun, right, to an extent, being willing to engage in these compromises in order to preserve the Union and stave off secession and disunion. So in 1820, as I'm sure many of our teachers know, right, the Missouri crisis of that year, where Missouri applies to for entrance into the Union as a slave state. Which would upset the delicate balance among free and slave states in the U.S. Senate, and whether or not the Union would accept into its ranks as a new state Missouri with its slaves and its pro-slavery constitution. Right, Southern slave states argued that if Missouri is not admitted with their slave constitution, they will leave the Union, they will secede. And right, thanks to the Great Compromise of 1820 and Henry Clay, the great compromiser, that is avoided with the 3630 line. And the Missouri Compromise, which says, of course, I'm sure most of our teachers know this, but in the Louisiana Territory Purchase, any territory south of the 3630 line may come in with slavery or may not, as they decide, but any states coming in north of that line, with the exception of Missouri, must come in as free states. Missouri comes in with its slave constitution. Maine is brought in as a free state, preserving the delicate balance, and civil war is avoided. Something very similar happens in 1850. Both sides are on the precipice of civil war in 1850, and it's only once again sort of on bringing forth this Herculean effort to save the Union does Henry Clay, through a series of measures pushing through the U.S. Congress, succeed in holding off civil war yet again. And in both cases, the question turns on the status of slavery in the territories. Andrew mentioned this earlier in the conversation, and I think it's related to the question, Chris, that you asked about, sort of the northern reaction what we see there. From Lincoln, it was always about, as we read in his first inaugural, keeping slavery, preventing the extension of slavery into the territories. Lincoln in the first inaugural says, I have no constitutional authority or inclination to touch slavery in the states where it currently exists, but I will do everything in my power to keep it from spreading into the territories. In the decades leading up to the election of 1860, that was the question. That was the only political question that was dividing the Union. The question of slavery, or more specifically, the status of slavery, the extension of slavery into the territories. In 1820 and 1850, both sides are able to reach a compromise on that point. But by the late 1850s, as Lincoln says in his House Divided speech, that there is no more room for compromise. How does he put it in the House Divided speech, right? He says, right, I do not expect the nation, the Union to fall, but I do think that it will cease to be divided. A house divided against itself cannot stand. That, to me, seems to suggest that although compromise has saved us in the past, by the late 1850s, a crisis is being approached that may not be able to be avoided again.
If I could just add to this, I think there's two elements that go along with what Jason is saying. The first is this: we know that there are far more citizens who live in the free states than in the slave states, but slaveholders actually held disproportionate political power all during the 1840s and 50s. And what that means is, by ultimately commandeering the Democratic Party, although a national party, to cater to slaveholding interests, slaveholders and slavery itself was protected in the Union as long as the Democratic Party enjoyed national prestige. The big problem comes when a new political, all you know this, when a new political party is born in 1854, whose platform is dedicated entirely to the restriction of slavery's expansion. That changes the game, because as Jason says, there is no more room to compromise over the issue of slavery's expansion. And what does that even mean when this new Republican Party assumes executive and congressional power in 1861? What is it that the president can do? Appoint Supreme Court justices, appoint a postmaster general that can restrict or enlarge anti-slavery or pro-slavery mail, appoint generals to the army. What if, I'm speaking from the slaveholders' perspective, what if the U.S. Army is transformed into an anti-slavery institution? What can Congress do? Obviously, write laws explicitly barring and restricting slavery's expansion. And so the issues are very real. I mean, this is not an imagined thing by any means. Also, remember what the Republican Party's slogan is in the 1850s: freedom national, slavery sectional, right? The idea being that slavery is the exception to national life. It's there. We can't touch it in the states where it exists, fine. But it is going to increasingly become the exception, pushed to the margins of national life. And Lincoln, all throughout the 1850s, makes the ideological case for this. There was one aspect of compromise that might have happened, and they came pretty close. Lincoln actually supported what would have been the first 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1861, which would have guaranteed the protection of slavery where it existed. Of course, the paradox is abounding there, because that didn't pass. Southerners rejected it, and some Republicans rejected it. Only for 4 years later, the real 13th Amendment banning slavery. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think Lincoln's reasons for supporting it would actually probably have confirmed some of the fears of the Southern seceding states. As Lincoln was okay with partial emancipation or abolition, perhaps, if you want to put it that way, knowing full well that over time the mind of the nation would ultimately move to extinguish slavery altogether, right? So yeah, it's a great point. Andrew, I'm glad glad that you brought in the politics of what's going on here, especially. And Jason, I mean, the statesmanship and the compromise is extremely important. But if you think about from the perspective, again, with the realignment of the parties, or the collapse of the Whigs, the creation of the new Republican Party, on the Democratic side in the 1850s, there are also some growing divisions that I think are worth noting. Within the Democratic Party, there's a division between, as you all know, the Stephen Douglas Popular Sovereignty Democrats, who, of course, take the position that we're not necessarily in favor of the expansion of slavery in the territories, but we're not opposed to it either, right? If they want it, they can have it. I think a while, they tend to have sort of control just because of numbers, being Northern Democrats of the Democratic Party. But there is that part of the Democratic Party, the southern part, that Breckinridge and others ultimately come to represent, which says we're not all that comfortable with popular sovereignty because we prefer actual expansion, right? Popular sovereignty doesn't go far enough in guaranteeing the expansion of slavery. So from the Democratic perspective, you think about the politics after the creation of the Republican Party, in a certain sense, everything seems to be going in the right direction for Southern Democrats. In 56, right, Buchanan's elected and Breckinridge is vice president, if I remember correctly, right? Things seem to be going their way in a sense, but they're still operating on the doctrine of popular sovereignty as the animating principle of the Democratic Party. Then Dred Scott comes along. Now all of a sudden you've got a Supreme Court decision which seems to support the more pro-expansion position of I just call them sort of like Breckinridge Democrats, and you couple that with what seems like judicial justification of the expansion of slavery, but you contrast that with what appears to be a turning tide in Congress in favor of the Republicans, right? So everything seems to be going their way at 54, 56, but then in 58, Democrats lose the majority in the House after the 58 elections, and Republicans pick up seats in the Senate. Right? Same, and I think by 1860, it has actually become pretty clear, even before the election in 1860, that Republicans were going to take Congress and that Lincoln was going to be elected president. Because I don't think, of course, we all know that Douglas and Breckinridge split the Democratic vote in a way, but it still probably would not have been enough to take away the victory from Lincoln. So the writing is on the wall in a certain sense. Now, the reason I'm going through this sort of laboriously here is because I think that's another bit of evidence to show that slavery really was the issue that led to the ultimate secession, right? When you look at the tide, the direction politics seems to be taking between 58 and 60, pro-slavery, pro-expansion Democrats, they see the writing on the wall. So, why not? If it's inevitable that we're going to have a Republican Congress and a Republican president, why not split the Democratic Party, make it clear, a clear show of unity, at least among Southern states, that, we're opposed to this. And then some ways that, I don't want to overdo this, kind of lays the groundwork for unity, or prepares the way for a kind of Southern unanimity with regard to secession. So,
if I could just add one quick point, there's one additional aspect of context here. Why is it that slaveholders all of a sudden start freaking out about their status in the Union when this anti-slavery Republican Party that hasn't acted yet takes over? We have to remember that by, maybe as early as the late 1840s, 1850s, the United States is one of three remaining societies in the Western Hemisphere that still sanction slavery. It's the United States, Cuba, and Brazil. The vast majority of the hemisphere had emancipated enslaved labor starting in the early 19th century. Slaveholders recognize this, but it's what they attribute to the United States' exceptional standing in the world. Like we are the remaining, if not the largest and most powerful slaveholding society in the world. This is what makes us unique. when you have a Republican Party, which white Southerners start to see as this internationalist foreign conspiracy, right? Grab hold of the reins of federal power. The fear translates into reality, in which slaveholders say, we are going to follow the same tide as the French colonies, the British West Indies. And what has happened down there, they say? Decay, regression, racial barbarism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is our future in the Union, they say. You read speeches also by secession commissioners that went to the various southern states to make the case for secession. What are they arguing? If the Republicans take control, we can guarantee you racial amalgamation, miscegenation, race war, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Look at the New World. The history is right there. This is not just some fantasy that we've concocted. We're looking back at history. We're looking at our present. We're next, in other words. So that's also happening.
So that's really an important point to keep in mind. I appreciate that very much. Billy has a kind of a follow-up question, I think, to some of the arguments that were made earlier. Talking about the myth of the Solid South, right, and whether that's been proven wrong. And he raises the question of why, if slavery was so important in the South, why were there so many counties in various states that voted against secession, right? Does that indicate that there was not, simply blanket? I think he's right. It indicates that there was not simply blanket support for the institution. Can we talk about how do we explain the sort of pockets of opposition to secession in parts of the South? Do either of you have some?
Yeah, I can give that a shot. I mean, it's a really good question. Going back to the election of 1860, Lincoln doesn't even appear on the ballot in the majority of southern states. I think he only appears on the ballot in 2 of the 11 states that eventually ended up seceding. One of those was Virginia. He didn't get many votes anywhere throughout the South, even in those 2 where he was on the ballot. In Virginia, he gets more votes than any other southern state, but all those votes come from the counties that eventually will become the new state of West Virginia, right? That will end up, in a strange twist here, right? Seceding from Virginia during the course of the war and joining the Union as a free state. Lincoln gets support in that area of Virginia, and Lincoln had always pointed out. I'm still not sure whether or not he was right about this or not. Lincoln always said that when you look at all of those so-called seceded states, Lincoln believed that the majority of the people in those states, all of those states with one exception, South Carolina, Lincoln always believed the majority of the people in those states were still decidedly pro-union and anti-secession. He didn't cite a lot of evidence for that fact. I'm not sure if that's an accurate representation or not. Lincoln even said, probably not South Carolina, but the rest of the states, you probably still have this silent majority who are pro-union and anti-secession. There may be something to that. Yeah. I don't know. I'm still not sure to this day.
Well, it kind of proved true, of course, in what we call the border states, right? And then parts of Virginia and Tennessee. I know the eastern part of Tennessee, for example, was really pro-union and anti-secession, so much so that the Confederates had to go in and take over by occupation East Tennessee, right, to keep them in line.
And you have the 4 border states like Kentucky and Maryland and Delaware and Missouri, these slave states that are pro-union,
right?
End up staying with the Union throughout the course of the Civil War. And if at any point they had gone over and sided with the Confederacy, the whole war probably would have been lost for Lincoln and the Republicans, right? What's the apocryphal line from Lincoln? I hope to have God on our side, but I must have Kentucky.
Right.
Yeah.
And that reminds me, too, that was another reason why Lincoln supported that initial 13th Amendment that Andrew mentioned earlier, right? Mm-hmm. Along with compensated emancipation.
That's right. Yeah.
There's a flip side to this as well. Why some regions oppose secession. There's a county in Mississippi, Adams County. The county seat is Natchez, which I trust you've heard of. It's in the southwestern part of the state. part of the state, right on the Mississippi River. Adams County was the wealthiest county per capita in the whole country in 1860. This is the heart of the Cotton Kingdom. Adams County voted fairly overwhelmingly against secession. Why? Mainly because they weren't crazy. They understood that their entire fortune, their security, their livelihood was best preserved in the United States. And so they flat out rejected leaving it, knowing that secession and war would be the author of their own destruction. This is what many prominent anti-secessionist Southerners made. This is the famous point Sam Houston from Texas made. A prominent Southern Democrat slaveholder who vehemently opposed secession for this reason. Not only did he believe in the nature of the Union, he did, but he also understood that slavery was best protected in the Union. And what is it that most swiftly and immediately kills slavery in the 19th century? It's war. Plenty of people understood this, and it speaks to the hubris, if we want to go there, of some of these secessionists.
That's a great point. So many great points. And we are coming close to the end of our time here. So try to get one more question and perhaps hear from the chat. Have either of you read McPherson's A War That Never Goes Away? I'm not sure if either of you are familiar with this. If not, we'll skip the question. I'm not familiar with it. A War That Never Goes Away.
Hold on just a second. I don't think that's the name. Let me look here. Oh boy.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with it. If not, that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll ask a different question. Try to sort of tie all of this together. Billy kind of asked a similar question. In general, what's the relevance of what can we take away from what we've discussed today and sort of circumstances, political and economic and social, that led to the Civil War? What can we take away from that? And it could still be relevant to us today, because I think that was. I think Billy says that was sort of the thrust of this piece by McPherson that he was referencing, that it's still relevant to us today to continue to think about, not just as a kind of exercise in the abstract study of history, but that there are lessons that can be taken away from this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll say very briefly on that front, that going back to the way that we see Calhoun and Alexander Stephens arguing in defense of secession. Their argument is predicated on a certain understanding of the American founding, right? That looks at American history, that looks at the founders in a particular way. That is to say, these guys really believed all men are created equal, and they were wrong. Whereas other folks that have been mentioned throughout the course of the discussion, like Stephen A. Douglas, particularly Roger Taney. Lincoln said, right, Taney was the first person, and Stephen Douglas, the second person to argue that when the founders said all men are created equal, they didn't really mean it, which of course is the popular view of the American founding today, and the view that you find in a lot of your textbooks. You find the Taney view, the Stephen Douglas view of the American founding in our textbooks. What you don't find today, somehow, the Lincoln and Frederick Douglass view of the founding, that the founders really believed all men are created equal, and they looked at slavery as a moral violation of the laws of nature and nature's God. That the founders really believed all men are created equal, and they despised slavery on moral grounds. Now, right, that's a whole different conversation on the founding and slavery. Well, why do some founders then continue to hold slaves even though they believe it to be morally wrong and unjust fundamentally? That's another conversation, though. But what we see here is what led up to the Civil War was this breaking apart of the American mind, the American soul, the American heart, between the Calhoun and Alexander Stephens school, the Stephen Douglas and Roger Taney school, and the Lincoln Frederick Douglass school, having three fundamentally different interpretations of the American founding and American history. We're seeing something similar in the modern day, I think. Our past and say, how ought we to understand ourselves and from where we've come from? And I think we're starting to fall into different camps and understanding our past in different ways. That is not new. That happened before. It happened from the 1820s up to the 1850s and culminated in Civil War. Now, I'm not saying that's where we're heading, but I am saying that the American mind is starting to again sort of split over these fundamental questions regarding what is the nature of our history, and is that history a good one or not, or what is the best way to understand the American history? That question, led to the division in the American mind leading up to the Civil War, and we're starting to see that again. It's an important question. Who do we side with? Is it Is it Stevens and Calhoun? Is it Tawney and Steve Douglas? Or is it Abraham Lincoln and Fred Douglass? That's a serious question that all Americans should think about and answer for themselves.
I'll just add very quickly, because I know that time's up. I couldn't agree more with what Jason is saying. I think there's a corollary to this as well. The lack of faith in institutions that seem to be percolating across the entire American body politic, I find to be extremely disconcerting. It is not the institutions, in my opinion, that is our problem. It is, well, I'm not going to get into what I think the problem is, but Lincoln's whole premise, I think, in the first inaugural and the July 4th address, is really rooted in the process, the system, the institutions are sound if we recognize their legitimacy. If we don't, then we have a problem. And I would just implore everybody to treat what's going to happen in 4 weeks with legitimacy. Let the system work. What does he say? Something about ballots are superior to bullets. He's not wrong.
Yeah, great. Gentlemen, I thank you for those very thoughtful closing remarks. That was extraordinarily appropriate to wrap this discussion up. And I want to thank you both for your time and your insights into this question and the way in which you handled it very, very judiciously, because this could be, if not handled carefully, this could be a very passionate question. So thank you very much. Very insightful. And I have, as always, learned a great deal from our conversation. So thank you very much, sincerely.
Thank you.
Thanks to everybody who joined us and submitted some fantastic questions. You'll receive an email within the next week or so with a link that you can click on to get your certificate of participation. You'll also have access to the audio and video recordings of this session for your use. Please check the other resources, look into the other resources that teachingamericanhistory.org provides. Lots of great resources for teachers and citizens and anybody else who's interested in thinking about their country. So our next webinar will be Saturday, November 7th, and we will consider the question, how did the progressives differ from the founders? So building on some of the things we talked on today, we will move into that next topic then. Until then, take care, and I hope to see you at our next webinar. Thank you.
You can learn more about our free resources for teachers, students, and citizens at teachingamericanhistory.org or TAH.org.